Um, this is my second episode of my second season of my podcast, Authentically Debz.
Sorry,
Uh,
Deb. I don't want to break in on you, but it probably makes sense to do it all in front of the mic. That way you don't get the in and out.
Thank you so much, Brian,
Yeah, you're
because,
welcome.
um, yeah, absolutely.
If you need to, I mean, obviously I cut you off. So if you got to start over, let's start over.
No, we're not going to start all over.
You can cut
I
it,
do
right?
this with voiceover. I do this with audiobooks. I don't know what my problem is with Zoom. I'm just used to
Yeah.
talking
Well, I
straight
mean, the
out.
face is right there, and then you're just like, oh, you kind of
No,
forget
but
that the
but
microphone's there.
thanks.
So
Yeah. So anyway, I mentioned my podcast, Authentically Debz. The first year was autobiographical, and really the through line of my podcast is my lifetime of suffering with OCD, uh, which is on the anxiety depression spectrum, certainly.
sure.
And I am delighted to have today Brian Sachetta, and he wrote Get Out of Your Head. Um, and I wanted to see what a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. Um, I well, I just want to welcome you, man. I'm so glad you're
Thank you.
here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Happy to jump into the book. Happy to talk about any of the subjects in it. So it's
Great.
nice to be able to sit here with you, discuss this, and get the message out there and help some people.
Wonderful. Um, I read the book, or actually, I listened to the book on Audible, and we'll probably let you talk about it, or I'll talk about it more. You can purchase it on Audible, on Amazon. Uh, you can read it on Kindle, and also Apple Books, and maybe even um, your website. Can you purchase it on your website?
The website kicks out to all the other
Got
retailers,
it.
but yeah, it's
Got it.
available through Amazon, Apple Books, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, Google Books. So mostly digital platforms. You can get a print copy through Amazon, and then I believe Barnes and Noble through their website. They use kind of like a distributor in the background, and I submit the book to that distributor, so you can get a paperback through Barnes and Noble if you want as well. So different ways to get it for different folks, and like you said, it's also available on Audible. Wanted to be able to get the message out to as many people as possible. It's obviously more work to have to put it on different platforms, but you talk to someone and they say, oh, I only read books on this platform or whatever it is. And you just want to be able to spread the message to anybody that no matter what platform they prefer or use. So
Right, and I really appreciate that you wanna get it out to everybody, because that's what you keep saying, and that's no doubt why you wrote the book. I also wanna mention that you didn't mention me that you have time constraints today, so if we get near that one-hour period and, you can just say, "Gotta go," or but I just wanted to let, the listeners know that that's a
sounds good. Yeah.
possibility.
If we do come up on that time period, I'll kind of, give a 5 minute warning or whatever it is. So
Okay. And I'm not going to do all the talking, so it's totally okay. This is your interview,
nice.
that you interrupt or butt in or whatever you need to do but I'm just so excited about your book. Before I let you jump in totally, um, in case you care, and for listeners, for people that hopefully are going to get this great book. I just wanted to go over a couple of notes I made that 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 your book really hit a chord with me. Um, in listening to it, you're really down to earth and you're very straightforward. You're sincere and you're also quite candid.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
this is, uh, getting a grip on anxiety, and I'm going to let you talk about that. Um, is no walk in the park. And but the thing I liked about the hope that you gave us, and no doubt it's true that you can learn coping mechanisms to deal with your own anxiety, perhaps in lieu of continual therapy visits, psychiatric sessions, or even medication. just briefly, for me with OCD, I tended to fluctuate between anxiety and depression, and it's lifelong with me. So I had my first real outbreak at 10, and so along along my life until I was about 50 when I self-diagnosed and then um, got diagnosed by a shrink. Um, I finally just had to do it myself, but I learned coping mechanisms along the way. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here talking to you. I wish I had your book way back when. Um,
I
so
appreciate that, and that that's part of why I wrote it was, we could obviously, there's a bunch of different jumping in points here or whatever, but one of the one of the things I talk about at the beginning of the book was being in college, having gone through anxiety in high school, and feeling like I didn't have the right tools at my disposal, the right information. And as I went through different situations that caused me anxiety, I kind of got to this point in the road where it was like, well, I've been able to find some stuff on the internet, but I don't totally know what I'm dealing with. And also, this is 2008, like long before Google. Like, I mean, Google search was most certainly a thing, but it wasn't the same beast that it is today. And the internet was just a much different place. So one of the things that got me to write the book was thinking to myself, like, here I am with this problem, right? We'll call it a problem. Obviously there's
well,
different words we could use,
it is
but
a problem.
yeah. So there's this problem that I have, and I'm actively trying to figure it out. I'm looking at other resources that, sure, maybe I could have done a better job researching things, looking up certain resources or whatever it was, but I just didn't find them. And so I said to myself, as maybe any inventor or product person would, I said, hey, let me go about trying to figure this thing out, and then when I'm done, I want to be able to turn around and share the things that I've learned with other people. At the time I was like, let's write a book, and I'll put all the strategies in there, and along the way I kind of lost sight of that, then came back to it, and so on and so forth. But that was you said, hey, I wish that I had this book. That was kind of, I think we both had that same epiphany of like, we needed this when we needed it, right?
Exactly, exactly, and not a minute too soon. Um, Another thing I noticed about your book is that, and I didn't mention. Well, I should just let you tell about yourself. Then I can mention this later.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
Go ahead and introduce yourself, and we'll just I'll just interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. So, yeah, Brian Sachetta. I am an author in the mental health space. I also, as of my full time job, I'm a software developer. A lot of people say to me, like, how do those two things correlate? Like, how does that make any sense? And I think in a lot of ways they don't, but in a lot of ways they do, right? It's like, as a developer or programmer, you're trying to solve problems, you're trying to engineer solutions, and I don't want to I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole or whatever, but you can draw comparisons between like the mind
What I
and a
was gonna
computer, right?
mention.
There's
That's
like,
what I thought
people
was
will
cool.
say like your CPU, your central processing unit, that sort of thing. So the brain itself and a computer have similarities. And I think I was able to, like, at least in my mind, like, kind of after the fact, because on one hand, it's like I'm doing some anxiety stuff over here, and on the other, I'm doing some software stuff over here. And I didn't really say I want to get into these two things because they relate to one another. It was more like I found the
You
relations after the
realize.
fact.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I kind of, I've found, I don't know, maybe a little niche for myself where it's like I'm able to draw conclusions from the software world, and I find mental health more interesting because of the software side of things, right? So
Interesting.
for example, this is a little bit technical, but hopefully some folks will find it interesting. So in software, when you start writing code, you can group blocks of code or pieces of code into what are called functions. So if I wanted to say, like, hey, software program, turn on the screen, right? I could just call those pieces of code, and I could call that function, and the operation that I want to be performed would be performed, right? And so there's a concept called recursion, which is, it's a software term, but it's also used in other areas of our lives, where
Right.
in software, recursion is when a software function calls itself. So instead of just saying like, hey, turn on the light, the function that says turn on the light tells itself to turn on the light. And so you kind of get this looping functionality of, like, the thing just keeps calling itself until you tell it to stop. And in a lot of ways, anxiety is sort of like this recursive function where something happens in our lives, we get fearful, we get anxious, and then we get fearful or anxious because we are fearful or anxious. And so it
Exactly.
becomes this recursive
Exactly.
program or this recursive problem. And one of the things that I found, just a parallel that I had concluded in my own life was like, in a recursive software problem or function, you need to tell the system to break out of its loop, right? And in a lot of ways, we need to say to ourselves, we are in these recursively anxious loops, and we need to break out of them by doing something different, changing our focus, going for a walk, going for a run, recanting an incantation, something like that. So, again, technical, a pretty technical subject there, but just one of the things that I found, especially parallels between the full time work I do and the writing I do.
Well, I can see how it definitely that how it ties in, how it helped you, and then you helped us by writing the book and, tying it in with that. Um, and I just love the idea that what you said when you first thought about writing it, when you became self-aware enough of your own anxiety and had some ideas that you just wanted to get it out to people to help them. Because
Yeah.
there's just nothing to compare with that kind of suffering. I mean, it's rough.
It
Um,
it definitely is, and there are all different kinds of suffering in the world, right? It's impossible to compare everybody's
right,
different
right.
forms of suffering, and I mean, I will definitely like the things that I've gone through are not nearly as bad as what many other people have gone through, continue to go
Me
through, but it's
too.
still it's still very difficult to deal with, and that was like I think everybody has to find their own path, right? And for me, it was kind of understanding that this is something that I deal with, something that I suffer with, and I wanted to be able to in some ways like turn that curse into some form of a gift and then share that gift with other people.
And people, let's face it, people are more likely to listen to you when you've walked that path. Um, can you maybe tell us a little about the 10 steps that you go through in getting out of your head?
Yeah, so a little bit of background there I think is probably in order. So the book itself, there's two parts to the book. So the first part is centered around like, hey, I'm in an anxious situation right now, or I feel fearful, or whatever it may be. I may be going through a panic attack, something like acutely like in the moment sort of situation, right? And
Exactly.
so what I like, a lot of my own experiences and research and that sort of stuff with anxiety revolved around like, hey, I find myself going on a first date and I'm really anxious about it, or I find myself going to a job interview and I can't stop ruminating, or
Or an
I'm like,
audition. Yes,
exactly, yep. So it's like I'm stuck in my head. I don't know what to do about it, and so much of like the content that I had created before I even like really sat down and put it into a book form was these individual steps that I would walk myself through when I was feeling really anxious, like in the heat of the moment, so to speak, right? And so there's a particular story in the book where I sort of like distilled all these down, put them into something of a framework, right? Like a particular day in my life. And so that's the story I tell of like the how the 10 steps came about. But it's interesting, right? Because it's like it's not like those ideas come to you out of nowhere. You have them somewhere in your head, and then you kind of just you put them all together at a specific point in time. It's kind of like the
exactly.
concept of like a an overnight celebrity or a overnight success, right? Like that person has been doing work. I think it relates well to the acting world. It's like that person has been putting in the work and the effort for a long, long time, and it now just finally pays off. But so anyway,
Exactly.
back to those 10 steps. The first part of the book is centered around each one of those. So I first introduce like the concept of this framework, which is again called the 10 steps to getting out of your head. And then I dedicate a chapter. Most of these chapters are fairly short. I dedicate a
Yeah.
chapter on each step to talking about like what the step means, how to utilize it, maybe some of the science behind it, if it's a scientific or a psychological phenomenon, excuse me. And then from there, so those are the 10 steps. Like I can dive deeper into that, but I kind of just want to quickly finish covering the rest of the idea of the book, right? So that first half of the book is kind of, hey, I'm in an anxious situation, I don't know what to do about it, let me walk myself through these different steps that some of them, some of them are sort of hacks or something like that to be able to walk your fear back a little bit. And then the second half of the book is a little bit more based around like, how do I create a life that has less fear in it overall? So how do I, what are some of the habits I can get myself into, so that way I find myself falling into fewer of those acute and anxious moments or situations. So yeah, happy, now that we've done some of the background, happy to talk about some of those individual steps and what
Yeah.
they might mean for us.
Um, well, of course, you mentioned breathing, and I know how important that is. And I'm not saying that's a real stretch for me right now, but meditating, returning to the breath with your thoughts rippling across as always. Um, do you go into that? Um, I mean, was that a big thing for you to really work on your breathing?
Yeah. So I think the interesting thing, I like to say to folks that one of the difficult things about writing in the self-help space is that there's like a very fine line between like sounding hilariously obvious and using common sense to really help people, right? Because a lot of the things that we talk about, you would hear it on its face and be like, well, yeah, like of course I would do that, right? But then you find yourself in a specific situation and you're too close to the problem where you can't like back yourself off enough to get that perspective that you need in order to say like, oh, well, that relatively obvious thing that I heard from that guy is something that I could apply here. And so what I'm getting at with that is, I'll say to people like, hey, to jump into it, right? The first step in the 10 steps to getting out of your head is to breathe. And again, it sounds like hilariously obvious, right? It's like, well,
Right, it
no duh,
does.
like I should totally breathe. I know to do that. But the thing is that like when we find ourselves in these situations that are full of angst and fear and whatnot, is we end up like stress embodies itself within our physical bodies. And so one of the key ways by which it does that is we change our breathing from like deeper, slower breathing in the diaphragm to shorter, more shallow breathing in the lungs. And so what happens is like from a I guess somatic perspective, or maybe psychosomatic or whatever, when within our autonomic nerve, excuse me, within our nervous systems, we have the autonomic nervous system, which is
Right.
a lot of the functions that happen automatically, right? We don't have to think about our hearts beating; they just kind of do it. And so there are a few divisions of the autonomic nervous system, but two of the ones that we really care about are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. And I'm trying not to be again too technical here, but basically what happens is
That's all
uh,
right.
people are probably familiar with like the fight or flight response system within the
Exactly.
body, right? And so that system is the sympathetic nervous system. So when we find ourselves in a situation where we think that we are in danger and we either need to fight with the force in front of us or we need to flee from it, our sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and all of a sudden it's like our bodies send lots of blood to our extremities, send our heartbeat racing faster, cause us to force us to breathe a little bit more in the lungs and just quickly avoid that situation as fast as we
Mhm,
can.
mhm.
And so there's sort of this like phenomenon where um, the thoughts that we think and the actions that we take can play into that activation. And so just as when we are in a sympathetic activation mode we are breathing shallowly, we can also activate it a little more when we are breathing shallowly. So the way that the parasympathetic nervous system gets activated, and that just to step back for a moment, that is called the there's a couple different names for it. It's either the rest and digest system or the feed and breed system. So it's kind of like, hey, everything's safe now. I can sit on the couch. I can eat a meal. If we're if we're getting into I don't know more. I, I don't even know how to describe it, but the thought is like, you're not gonna as if you were a caveman or something, right? And
Yes.
your evolutionarily speaking, your mission is to reproduce, right? Like you can't reproduce, you can't for lack of a less vague term or less of a lack of a nice term, like you can't reproduce when you're in fight or flight mode, right? It's just not going to happen. And so, in order to get ourselves, in order to activate the parasympathetic nervous system within the body, one of the best ways we can do that is by breathing deeply. And we also want to do that slowly, methodically through the diaphragm, through the belly, rather than through the lungs. And that is actually like a key way. So that deep sort of breathing activates the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve is responsible, is part of, partly responsible for restoring, the calmness within us, activating that
I was really
parasympathetic
glad.
nervous system.
I was really glad that you brought that up in the book because, I've been told so many times, breathe deeply, and I'm like, why? Because
Exactly.
when you're in that position, when you're in that anxious position, why? I just want to get out of here, or, or punch you in the face, something.
Yeah.
Um, so it was good to know why, that it activates that parasympathetic,
Exactly. Yeah. And I
yeah,
think, again, going
and
back
why
to
it
the like,
works.
yeah, not wanting to sound hilariously obvious, right? It's like stepping back and saying, like, this is why you should do things. These are the scientific breakdowns behind why this is important or why it works. I think that gets people bought in a little bit more, right? And then all of a sudden we can say to ourselves, like, oh, that's what's going on when I'm in that situation. That's, I was really anxious, and I checked my breathing and I realized that I was all up here, right? I was kind of in my lungs. Whereas when I was able to have the awareness to say, look, Brian, like, you're in some sort of situation that is scaring you. You got to chill out. You got to take the deeper breaths, both in and out. And I should add that, technically speaking, the parasympathetic activation only happens when you breathe out. So when you
Good to
breathe
know
in,
too.
yeah,
Yeah.
when you breathe in, you technically activate the sympathetic nervous system. Uh, the funny thing is, most of us have already activated it by the time that we're in an anxious situation. But then when we breathe out is when we kind of slow our heartbeat back down a little bit, and
Mhm.
activate that parasympathetic nervous system. And what I usually say to folks is, like, if you're not breathing in fully, then you definitely can't breathe out fully. And so
That's
if you've got
true.
these shallow breaths, then you're really not going to get that parasympathetic nervous system activation that you want. And then, one way or another, you will get through the anxious situation that you're going through. But I guess you're not doing yourself any favors in regard to the breath if you don't
Right.
slow
So
yourself down and take those
these are
deeper
not
ones.
sequential steps necessarily that you have to do every one of them. For
You don't.
just if you just breathe. I mean, you're talking about, oh, it sounds so, common sense, but your book is common sense. And
It is, and that's kind of the thing that I get at, right? Or that I've been getting at is, it is common sense, but at the same time, when you apply it and you have those lessons around, like, this is why I should apply it, then I think it
exactly.
ends up being more helpful for people.
Then
And
you
one
trust. Then you
ex-
trust.
exactly, yep. Otherwise, you're just kind of flying blind, right? And I think one of the main reasons why I call it a toolkit rather than, well, there are many
They're
reasons.
tools.
Some
Yeah, and
exactly, yep.
I've
So these
used
are
all of them
exactly.
necessarily.
You have some sort of toolkit, workbox, whatever it is, and let's say you find yourself in some situation. You take out the hammer, you take out the wrench, you take out the nails. Maybe you don't need the screwdriver or whatever it is, right? So obviously it's interesting because you change your strategies as you get older, and I actually wrote the book now probably 3 years ago, working on a second one now, but
Yeah,
at the time I
we're
was
gonna
a little
talk about
more
that.
stubborn and kind of being like, hey, I know how to, fix anxiety, and this is what you do. And as I get older, I'm like, I'm really glad that I actually said, this is a toolkit. Take the steps that work best for you, because it really is that kind of thing where not every strategy that gets put out there is going to resonate with everyone, right? And so I think
Exactly.
the actual, I can't use the word cure, but like the actual solution is a personalized and tailored one where you're able to listen to all these different ideas, and then you synthesize down the ones that work best for you based on how your mind works, how your body works, the
Right, and
situations you
and
find yourself
depending
in.
on what type of situation you're in. Um,
Exactly.
People are always saying, the answer to everything is to stay in the present moment because all we have is now. And gee, that's pretty simple, but that's not easy. Um, and again, I'm so glad you started with the breath because that's really the beginning of everything.
It
Um,
definitely is, right? It's that awareness, right? Is like when you are not breathing and your mind is running a million miles a minute, it's very hard to do anything else. Like I think I actually say in the book, like there as it's kind of done on purpose, right? As part of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system, like logic is not an innate part of that, right? If we were being chased by somebody with a knife and we were in fight or flight mode, but as part of that fight or flight mode, we were like, hey, let me stop and think about this for a second. Like we could be dead, right?
we
So
could be dead. There is a
exactly.
place for fight or flight,
Yep.
definitely.
So it's important, if you're going to get into a state where you're able to think a little bit more rationally about things, get back into the present moment, and remind yourself of some of the strategies that you have at your disposal. You first got to get yourself out of that fight or flight state, and the easiest and fastest way to do that is through the breathing. So it's like once you've applied that step, the other ones become more accessible to you. It's very hard to think through some of the logic that's maybe required in those steps if you're if you're in your head, if you're freaking out, if you're in fight or flight mode. So yeah, that's why I started with it.
Yeah. Um, I'm definitely older than you are, but I will say that the most important thing for me that I got from your book um, is that this deep breathing really helps. And now I know why. And now I trust it. And now I'm actually finally beginning to use it in every aspect that I can. Um,
It's great.
I heard something today, this is deviating a little from what we're talking about, but not that much, about how suicide was really on the uptake with kids. With kids from like especially 10 to 12, and I know that even as a teenager or a young teenager, it's like um, you rarely have the feeling that whatever you're dealing with that's making you feel suicidal, nervous, whatever, you rarely have the feeling that this is going to pass. This feels very permanent.
It's a very good
Um,
point.
so, what do you tell? I know you mentioned in the book, but what do you tell people about that? I mean, how do you know this is going to pass?
Yeah,
Again, with the breathing, you should have figured that out. But go ahead.
I think so. The things that you just said, like there's so much that we could unpack there, and I could talk
Yeah,
for hours about it, right?
yeah.
It's obviously so tragic that younger people are finding themselves in more dark situations, feeling like they're in despair, they have no hope, that sort of thing. And
And that's it.
again, there's a
Yeah.
million things we could talk about there, whether it's um, you know some of the divisive things in society, or it's social media use, or whatever it is. There are a lot of contributing factors as to why
That's a
people
big
feel
one.
that
That's
way.
a big one. Yeah.
But I do think that as a young person, the disadvantage that you have is that you don't have enough life experience to know that certain things go a certain way, that even if something goes poorly, you'll be okay in the end, right? And this is not to say that folks that are going through such experiences aren't going to be able to convince themselves that things are going to get better and that whatever they're going through will pass. It's just that it like, again, kind of going along with how we opened this podcast was, I speak frankly. I kind of give like a no BS attitude. I give a lot of tough love, and I just want, like, I don't want to sugarcoat things. I want people to understand what they're dealing with, and then be able to realistically look at it and say, like, hey, let's move forward, right? And so, I would look at the same thing with what you're talking about here with young kids, when it's like, I mean, obviously it's a very sensitive subject. I do not have experience in dealing with 10 and 12-year-olds, and like, helping them emotionally, right? Like maybe some of them have read my
Maybe
book, but
because
like
they haven't read your book yet.
well, it's
Because you
possible, right? But
Yeah.
maybe they have, but they haven't reached out to me or something like that. So it's a very sensitive subject. It's one that's difficult to talk about. But I think at the same time, right? It's kind of uh, I'm a little like, I'm older than those folks, right? And so I have been through some of the situations that maybe we're talking about, where things look grim, and we say to ourselves, or we would be tempted to say to ourselves, like, I'm screwed here, my life is over, whatever it is, right? And I think, a lot of people say as you get older, you have that wisdom of, you've been through different situations, you've been through experiences that teach you those sorts of things. And so I guess the leg to stand on here is probably not for a 10 or a 12-year old, like, hey, use your experience, right? Because they just don't, unfortunately, they don't have as much experience. But again, going back
Right.
to the let's not sugarcoat things, I think it's important, if any of those folks are listening, to remember that, like, uh in some ways, right, like you and I have been there before. We are older than they are, and we are on the other side of it, saying we've been through some pretty terrible things. I would imagine that those folks have as well, but we've made it out on the other side. We're able to get the perspective. I mean, just kind of an example. One of the stories I discuss at the very end of the book is I was on a family vacation in Hawaii, and we get a push notification from the government basically saying that we're about to get nuked. And a lot,
Ah,
like,
yes.
a lot of people will say to me, like, hey, like, oh man, like, you're writing stuff about anxiety, like, you're a privileged white kid, like, what do you have, that like, who are you to talk about this sort of stuff, right? And it's like, I think it's difficult because on the face of a situation, or just by looking at someone's life, like, I have no idea what anybody has been through, right? And I'm definitely not trying to say that nobody could understand what I've been through. Again, going back to what I said earlier, a lot of people have been through a lot worse than I have, and I stand by that. But at the same time, it's not to say that I haven't been through anything that is challenging, right? And so I look at a situation like the one I described, where in Hawaii, like, me and my family are sitting in the living room waiting to die, right? Like, get blown off the face of the map. And I think just using those sorts of experiences as teachers to folks to say, like, hey, maybe you don't quite know the things that have happened in my life, but, like, here's one example. And would imagine you could relate to that being very terrifying, basically as bad
Oh,
as
it
it
has.
gets.
Yes.
And we made it through. And I think, that I don't want to, like, give any survivorship bias, right? Like, unfortunately, there are situations where people are afraid, and like, it's the bleak reality is, like, people die in the US, people get murdered, sorts of those things, right? But things of that sort. But I think the important thing to remember, when we're talking to younger folks who are, like, feeling like things will never pass, right, is it's just relaying our experiences back to them and saying, like, hey, I've been through what you've been, what you're going through now. I'm here to help you in any way that I can. I'm here to support you. I'm here to let you know that it does get better, and please lean on me when you need to. Please reach out to me, that sort of thing. And again, it's very difficult when we start comparing, like, my hurts, your hurts, your experiences, his experiences, that sort of thing. But I think the main thing is just being there for those people and saying, like, look, I've been through some difficult situations. I don't know what you're going through. I'm not trying to compare that, but I'm here for you, and I promise you we're going to get through it, right?
Yeah, I think again, I think trust is such an important thing, and I think that one thing that younger people have that even younger than you, that kids have that we don't, they are quite open-minded. They're not as closed-minded as many, shall I say, most adults or many adults, and, so they're open to that. If they believe someone cares and they say, "This is really gonna pass. This isn't always gonna be this way." Um, I don't know, did you grow up with social media? Are you, uh I
I was
mean, as
kind of
far
right on the fringe. Like, I think we
Yeah,
got Facebook when I was a junior in high school, and so Twitter
okay,
was in college. Instagram, I remember, was, like, right as we were leaving college. So
so
not quite, right? I mean, nothing
right,
compared to, I talk to my cousins, and their kids are 11 and stuff like that, and they say all sorts of bullying that goes on these platforms. It used to be the kids would get picked on in school, and then they'd go home, they'd get relief because they're out of the situation, they get to clear their mind by playing with their friends, playing video games, whatever it is. And now, from what I hear, it's like they go home and they're expected to be on social media where the bullying continues, right? And it's
right.
like, that's one of those things where, again, we just can't compare, like, experiences, right?
No, and
All
it
I can know is that sounds terrible, right?
well,
And having gone through difficult situations before, if I was talking to somebody in that situation, I would say, like, hey, I'm here for you. Please tell me whatever you feel comfortable telling me, and I'm going to help you through this.
again, because this generation is so really glued to their phones. It like you say, when they get home, does it stop? Only if they s disconnect. Um, I had a dream, I guess couple of years ago now, and I did not grow up with social media at all, but I dreamed that I was bullied to the point on social media that I really did wanna take my own life, and that was the I forced myself to wake up, I've learned to do that, but I never understood that until I had that dream, that was like, "I'm just a piece of shit." I mean, it's like I don't need to live any longer. That's how much it affected me.
Yeah.
So, I can, relate to that. But again, going back to the same thing, they have to have someone that they can trust, and we can just hope for the best, and hope you can have some kind of communication with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, it's one of the kind of going back to this comparison point, right? Like I take so I get some reviews on my book and I take those seriously. I'm trying to help people, right? Like so if somebody says like this wasn't helpful or I didn't understand this or whatever it was, then I want to read those comments. I want to either maybe adjust the content or write about it in a follow-on post or address it in a subsequent book, things of that nature. And I
Or even address the person. Can you do that?
you can't do it anymore. You used to be able to,
Okay.
but they turned off that feature on a lot of the review sites. But so I'll have some folks say like, "Hey," write and say like, "Hey, I'm going through like a health crisis or whatever," and like you're talking about like being nervous about going on a first date, like that pales in comparison to what I'm going through, right? And it's just so difficult. It's like if I could sit down with that person, I would say, "Hey, I'm not trying to say that I'm any better, that what I'm going through is any easier or harder than what you're going through." Like, I mean, if I'm speaking objectively, it's like what that person is going through sounds far worse. But like, I'm trying to put the content out there to help people, not to have them like compare our notes and
Not to
say,
compare.
yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. And it just comes back to having that trust, being like, hey, this is a person who understands the fundamentals here and can apply them in specific situations or different situations, and regardless of what that situation is, that person can help. So that's the kind of person that I don't know, the public figure that I'm trying to put out there. And it's difficult, right? You can't please everyone, but again, like the bottom
It's a
line
great
is,
book. It's a great book, Brian.
thank you.
It's helped me, so it's never too late, folks, and, it's interesting you mentioned the reviews because I was just reading some of your reviews and, especially on Amazon, and I thought, "Whoa." I I don't think I saw one negative review. I mean, they were all almost like, what, 5 stars? I mean, it's like and I read them and I thought, "Wow." So if you do wanna purchase Brian's book on Amazon, check out these reviews, see what people say.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I
Wow,
mean, there definitely are some negative ones, but it's tough
I
because it's
honestly
like,
didn't see any. Honestly didn't see any.
yeah, I
I
mean, maybe,
looked,
yeah,
but
maybe,
I believe you. They don't
yeah,
they don't
you
they
just
don't leave them on forever,
exactly. You just
so
got to look in this in specific places or whatever. But I think with a book like this, and again, it's not about me, right? I'm trying to help people, but you think about like, hey, I feel like I'm putting my soul out there, right? Like I'm revealing some of my deepest stories, my emotions, that sort of thing. And then when
that's
somebody
why
comes up
people
and
listen. That's why
yeah,
people
and it
listen.
is, right? But I guess it's a double-edged sword when folks say like, "Hey, like don't buy this book, 1 star, this person is not a PhD." It's like, well, I mean, that was on the second page of the book. You could have done better than that, you know? So,
Um, we're talking about your wonderful book, Get Out of Your Head, uh, a toolkit for dealing with anxiety. But I also have to mention your kick-ass website. I mean, it's the most functional website I've seen. I mean, I'm an actor. I have a pretty good one, and, I do other stuff like podcasting and audiobook and all that, but, I m mine's not as good as yours. I mean, it yours just covers everything. Um, and I also was gonna ask you earlier, and somehow I didn't, if you could hold up the physical copy of your book,
oh yeah, go
because
right
I
ahead.
read it on there we go, there we go. And now we have the little snake head, and
Exactly.
or the big snake head.
Yep.
Um, let's see, and I know that, that that was very intentional. Um, and do you want to go into why that was intentional?
Yeah, so kind of speaking on the speaking on the website, speaking on the branding, we actually did a little bit of a rebrand this year. So the original book cover was something different.
Very different.
There's a book of the same name that's in the space that's actually done very well. Was causing a lot of confusion in the marketplace as to like which book was which, and that was a serious problem. So
Yeah.
some of it was that, some of it was wanting to create a little bit more cohesive of a brand because what the imagery that I had before when I'm thinking about like how does it apply to a next book, how does it apply to a website, like we just didn't quite get there symbolically. And so my designer and I, we sat down and we basically said to ourselves like, I actually there's a blog post that I wrote recently, so it's on getoutofyourhead.com. If you wanted to read that, you would go to getoutofyourhead.com/blog. It'll be one of the first few posts on there. It's about the snake brain, and so kind of
Yes,
does a deep
exactly.
dive into the just some of the symbolism and the ideas and the emotions behind the new branding. And basically, so my designer and I, we went through this process, basically trying to figure out like what is it that we're trying to say with the imagery. What are we trying to what emotions are we trying to convey? And like if somebody were to look at this, like would they understand what the topic is better than say the original cover, which was a boxing glove that was shaped like a brain, which I mean I love that one too, but we made the decision to
I'm
change.
glad you did because all I saw was a brain.
Interesting,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
So again, we were intentional about this process in terms of changing the branding over to this snake. And so if you think about it, I mean, the concepts are still, there's an overlap in concepts between the two logos in the sense that there is this like sort of hidden brain. Maybe it feels more hidden for others than for you, but like there's a brain hidden within or that lies within some other whatever it may be illustration, right? And so
Right.
what we did was you come up with a lot of different ideas when you're redesigning something.
Well, to me,
And
it just meant what you said. I'm not creating this statement, but it was just like no bullshit. I mean,
yep,
this is a way. This is one of the ways to handle your anxiety. And again, we
yeah,
have a toolkit.
and
And
that was definitely that's a big part of it. The other part is kind of the snake symbolism, right? Like the kind of getting the message across that the mind can be a scary place and it can also coil
exactly.
much like a snake does and tighten. And that's how snakes can kill their prey is by coiling around them. And so
Right.
often like our minds don't kill us, but we feel
They can.
trapped. They can, yeah, or that they can lead us to those sorts of things. And our the idea was sort of getting the message across that our minds can tighten around us and make us feel trapped, make us feel really anxious, make us feel scared, that sort of thing. And obviously, these are the deeper levels of symbolism. You wouldn't necessarily get that off the bat if you just looked at the logo, but we wanted to convey that sense of the snake like mind, the coiling mind, and the idea that the snake. Or excuse me, the mind can be a bit of a serpent, right? It can
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
not our own, it can be an enemy sometimes, it can be not our own best friend or not a good thing for us. And one of the other messages we wanted to convey was like the idea that when you follow this brand, when you take the strategies that it puts forth, you can sort of tame the snake, so to speak. So the concept that, or the name for the concept that we came up with was like a tameable beast. And it's a little in the
I
design
don't think
weeds there,
that's
but
such a stretch. I really think because thoughts create. Um, they create the fear. Do you do you agree?
oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a huge focus of the book is basically that, people may
I'm
say,
glad you
"Oh,
agree.
thoughts, they're just random things floating through my mind. They hold no weight." And I said, in the book, why don't you sit down and think to yourself of think vividly of something that you really don't want to happen. Picture that happening, and you will feel a cascade of chemicals going through your body. You'll start sweating, maybe your heart might race a little bit. And so it's like, thoughts, like you said, thoughts create. They're a lot more powerful than maybe we give them credit for. And so we want to highlight that with the design. And yeah, we like, as you alluded to, wanted to convey a sense of no BS, right? I think we
Right.
looked around the marketplace and we saw and this is no, like, I'm not criticizing anyone. It was just the way that I wanted to convey things versus how maybe other folks do. And you see in the mental health space, you see a lot of like bright colors or calm colors and like rainbows and unicorns and that sort of thing.
But
And there's definitely,
it's very eye-catching, and it doesn't look like a mental health book. I mean, you
yep.
know, it says what it should say. I mean, get out of your head, all that, but it's very eye-catching and on a different level. Um, I saw that immediately. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, so we wanted to be a little bit different, right? I think sort of conveying that message to folks of like, hey, this is difficult. Like the things that you're going to be dealing with are difficult, right? Just like taming a snake would be. And we're not going to sugarcoat it by putting rainbows and unicorns and clouds and things in our branding. It's more of like a, hey, here's the snake. It's right in your face. We're going to figure out, we're going to give you strategies for dealing with it. We're going to help you overcome that sort of thing. And don't get me wrong, there's certainly a place for positivity and rainbows and unicorns and clouds and that sort of thing in the market, but maybe that wasn't our niche, I thought. So
Yeah.
that
And
that's
it's
that's the story
kinda
behind the branding.
oversaturated anyway, I would say.
Yeah.
Um, it is what it is. Um, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I assume, but I wrote a blog post about this
You
last
did,
week, which
you
I
did.
assume you're referencing. And so I think, when we were growing up, right, there was this sense of like, if you just say, "Hey, man, it is what it is," like you sound passive, you sound defeated, right?
I
And
I I didn't even used to know what that meant. I mean,
yeah, it's
it's
funny.
like
Different circles that you hang in
yeah,
or whatever. And
yeah.
so we used to say that to ourselves of like, hey, if you say it is what it is, like you're a wimp or whatever, right? And as I did a lot more work with this brand and I, wrote the books and do the blog posts and that and just grew up over time. You look back on certain things, whether it's this statement or something else, and you have a different perspective on it. And I couldn't help but think to myself, like, wow, we were really off on that, right? In the sense of, so if we look at it and we say that the term "it is what it is a passive or defeated
Not at all. Yeah.
mindset, um, it's it seems like that's the wrong way of looking at things. I think there's a dichotomy in the sense of like, if there is something in your life that you can do something about and you could effectively make change on that thing, whatever it may be, then to say to yourself it is what it is and to not try to change the situation, then that would be passive.
That would be
But
passive.
right, but the dichotomy is contingent upon understanding when you can exert control or influence over the situation, right?
Right,
And
and
so
before you can do anything, you really have to accept where you are. I
exactly,
mean,
yep,
even for just a couple of seconds, like if a lion is chasing you, you have
right,
to accept that.
right. You
Um,
say, hey, I don't like that I'm here. Maybe it is what it is that I'm here, but the
but I'm
outcome,
out of here.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. The outcome has yet to occur, and so the outcome is not what it is. I'm out.
exactly.
So yeah, that post was kind of touching on those things, and where it really related to mental health was basically saying to yourself that if if you refuse to believe that so let's just say there's a situation in your life that is like has been resolved, is done, the outcome is unchangeable, and
Mhm.
maybe you don't like it, right? Like let's say, just for example, you have a job interview for your dream job, you get turned down. If you refuse to say it is what it is, then you're going to cause yourself a lot of stress, anxiety, disappointment, all sorts of negative emotions because the page has turned on that event and there's really nothing left you can do. So once you've exhausted all the possibilities, I actually would argue that to say it is what it is actually a very good and defensive strategy in the
Me
sense that you're
too.
saving yourself all of that agony.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely use that, um, as an actor for sure. Um, okay, what else did I wanna ask you? There's so many things, and so little time.
Yeah, I
Um,
could talk all day.
um, can you talk a little about the counseling that you do? I know this is not the book, but again, I'm in love with your website also,
Thanks.
and, tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so
for
I
you?
don't call it counseling, and I'm not really allowed to, right? So I full
Oh, I'm sorry.
transparency. I
Okay.
no, it's okay, it's okay. I don't, I don't have a degree in medicine. I don't have a PhD. Like again, full transparency. I have an undergraduate degree in administration and computer science, right? So,
And you
my,
didn't mention Boston College, so I'm
yep.
gonna
So yeah,
mention
so
it.
that's where I went to school, and so what I call it is coaching, right? Is
Coaching,
sort yeah,
coaching, yes.
sort of like good conversations with a helpful friend, or that friend who gives you tough love, right? And it varies depending upon where my job as a coach is to understand who the person is that I'm talking to, right? Like in a sport, you would size up the player and you would say, this person is clearly a point guard, that person is a center. I need to coach them differently because they have different skills and they have different ways of performing on the basketball court, right?
Mhm.
So it's my job to figure out, like, who is it that I'm dealing with? What do I think are going to be the most effective ways for that person to understand or process or get through what it is that they're going through? And again, it kind of going back to the toolkit idea, right? Like, there are some folks who don't find some of the strategies that interesting, or they may say, like, going back to the 10 steps, I may say, like, hey, step 6 is to stop questioning yourself. And somebody may say, like, I don't question myself. I don't have any self-doubt. It's something else, right? And so it's my job as a coach to say, okay, that strategy doesn't apply here. I need to obviously switch to something else, because I don't want the lessons that I teach to fall upon deaf ears. It's my job to tailor that, almost it's my job to create, like, do a better job of tailoring the toolkit to that specific person. Whereas if that person were instead reading my book on their own, they would do that themselves. And there's also a little bit more of the, like, the book can be a little bit more high level because
But
it's
you mention the, website in your book, don't you?
it's
At some
definitely in
point?
yep, it's
Yeah,
definitely in the book. Yeah, it's in the back, I believe, in the back
yeah.
matter. But yeah,
Um,
so it's like, the conversations in coaching are more like, hey, this person may be coming to me with a specific problem or a specific situation, and they want me to help them get through it. Whereas the book may be like, that person is trying to get a whole new lens on anxiety in their life in general.
and they may just wanna do that themselves,
Exactly. Yep.
unless they do wanna reach out later. Um, have you ever, to your knowledge, worked with someone that has OCD? Which
So
which
it's interesting, right? Because you said earlier that there's a spectrum, right, of
yes.
anxiety and depression, and that's, you were like, OCD lives on that spectrum. And so, I mean, I am not really, like, I can't diagnose someone, right? I'm not a doctor, but so, and not everybody that I
I
work
just meant,
with.
did you have a gut feeling? Because
Okay, got it. Yep.
okay.
So I would, yeah, long and short, I would say yes. It's, again, I'm not going to be the one to say, like, hey, I think that sounds like OCD or whatever it might be, but where I was going with the spectrum thing is, like, just as you can say, like, hey, this exists on this range of symptoms or diseases or whatever it may be, like, I can work with somebody who has anxiety and in the back of my head say, like, this sounds a lot like what they're going through is some sort of compulsive disorder or obsessive disorder,
Mhm.
or the both. So definitely, I obviously got to maintain client confidentiality, but
Well, of
yeah,
course.
the
Yeah,
answer is sure.
yeah. And, can we talk a little bit anyway, well, before we get to that, I do you wanna say anything about how people, that I haven't already mentioned, maybe we should reiterate that again before you leave us, can purchase your book, how they can reach out to you, etcetera?
Yeah, definitely. Good idea. So, yeah, just a quick time check. We got 4 minutes here. But yeah, I would say a couple things. So, the easiest way to interact with me or find me or whatever is on my website, getoutofyourhead.com. There are all sorts of resources there. My blog, you can reach out for coaching. You can find
It's a
my books
great
there.
website.
Thank you.
Yeah, very
So,
thorough, and, also, I will be mentioning that in the show notes below this podcast. Um,
great.
so, yeah,
Yeah, so that's the easiest way to just get involved with the brand and find
yeah,
the content and that sort of thing. So
and, I mean, just listening to you, even oh, and you audio narrated your own book.
I did do that. Yep.
Way to
I don't know if
go.
I don't know if I'd be doing that again. It's just a lot of work, and
Yes,
there
it
are
is.
other people who are better at that than I am. And then,
Well,
on top of
guess
that,
what?
yes.
You're probably gonna be even better at it, with this next book. So, I wouldn't rule it out. I
Yeah,
wouldn't
just
rule it out.
a timing thing. It's like if I'm still working on getting the book formatted, then I can outsource the narration, and we can both be
True,
working on two things
true,
at the same time. So
true.
yeah, that's the plan for now. And
Okay.
but I am looking forward to when it'll be nice when there's another audiobook out there and folks can consume the books. I like the fact that if somebody says, "Hey, I don't really read books, I don't have time," or whatever, it's like, "Hey, well, you either commute to work every day, or you go to the gym, or you work out at home, or you have some downtime or some time where you can
Yeah,
do something a little more passively, right? Like, here's the opportunity to pop in my voice, to pop in my narrator's voice, get some, pick up some skills, pick up some new learning." So,
absolutely. So, in about the minute we have left, can you
yep,
talk a little bit about the second book, which will be on depression,
it will. Yeah,
or how to deal with depression, which I would to me, that would be, uh, very difficult,
Yeah,
more
it's a
so than
tough
even the
one. I mean, it
anxiety.
really is a tough one. I think this book is focused a lot more around a sort of like empathetic view of understanding, like, hey, I can't know what you're going through, you can't know what I'm going through, but here are some of the things that I can put forward that maybe can help you see things in a different light. And they're like, it's interesting. I know I got to wrap up quick, but the every book sort of has some sort of theme or voice or tone, right? And I end the book kind of on like a tone of solidarity, right? Of saying to the reader, like, hey, like, what you can't underestimate what you've gone through. Like, depression is so difficult to deal with, and nobody can take that away from you. And if you are still here, then, like, you're clearly a fighter, and you are clearly
Amen.
somebody who has a lot of heart and a lot of guts. And I salute you. So,
And there's some very similar steps to walking your way out of it, baby steps. I mean,
yep, baby steps
I
for sure. So,
real quickly, I can remember when I was in a group therapy session and I was very depressed, and, it was suggested to me that I do something, and I said, "No, I'm just gonna wait until I feel better." No, that's not it.
yeah, well, it's
But
it's it's
anyway.
I do have to jump, but it's interesting you talk about that thread. That idea is something that I discuss in the book. So, looking forward for that one to come out. A lot of things that I got to do before I get that one on the market, but
But will you
I,
come
I'm
back
I'm
and talk to us about it?
oh, absolutely, yep. I'm
Oh,
I'm proud of that
wonderful.
one, and I hope to help some more people. So,
Okay.
excited for that.
Thank you for coming, Brian,
Absolutely,
and,
thank you for having me,
we'll have
Deborah.
every way of people accessing it, okay? We'll have it
Sounds
on
great.
we'll have it on YouTube, we have it here. I'll even I'm putting it on my Facebook and Instagram and Twitter as well. So
Perfect, and we'll
so
connect offline. We'll get the details. So,
cool, cool.
appreciate the time, and be well.
You
Talk to you soon.
too. Okay,
Okay,
bye.
bye now.
Today, for my second episode of my second season of my podcast, Authentically Debz, I had as my guest Brian Sachetta, author of the keenly informative book, Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. His book can be purchased on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible through activating the link https://amzn.to/3b capital Z lowercase b capital WOF. And please subscribe to my podcast, Authentically Debz, and blessings to all.